really interesting to think about how whites tend to consistently perceive danger in a lot of communities with maybe new immigrants and traditionally African American communities. Can you talk a little bit about why those kinds of perceptions persist?
These perceptions are, in a sense, pernicious because they lead to almost a vicious cycle. And what I've done is to try to think about how communities sometimes are caught up in poverty traps. And what I mean by that is that there are certain cycles that communities go through, and sometimes it's really hard to break out of that cycle. And part of the reason has to do not just with the vulnerability of the population in terms of low income, but the stigma that's attached to certain communities because of the composition of the population. Now, I want to be clear that perceptions of, let's say, minority groups or immigrant groups, that there's more disorder. This is not coming out of thin air. It's not just that people are racist or are bigoted. It's more complicated than that. Again, if we look at it historically, the ports of first entry for immigrants tend to be the lowest income, and there is higher levels of disorder. And when it comes to crime, in general, for violent crime, which people tend to be quite fearful of, in the United States, historically, rates are higher in African American communities than they are in predominantly white communities. That's a fact. So what happens, though, is that that pattern is then perceived in a way that goes beyond the data. So if I don't know anything about a particular neighborhood, and it may be middle income, it may be low crime, and the only thing I see is the race of the person on the street, then given that history, it's often the case that people will immediately, unconsciously, attribute to that high crime rate based on what they know from the past. We all do this about many things in life. We make quick decisions, and there's such an association between violent crime in the American mindset and racial status that even though there's an historical and even present correlation, that people act on those perceptions, and the point of a poverty trap or perceptions leading to a vicious cycle is that by acting on those, we sometimes reinforce those very differences. Quick example. So if I perceive there to be more disorder in a neighborhood because some immigrants move in, even if maybe the absolute level of disorder didn't increase, but I thought it did, then I may decide to move out. And suppose I'm middle income. Well, then I take resources with me. I pay taxes, which are no longer going to be collected for the public schools. You start to add that up, and you have changes in the population that are driven purely by perceptions. And what the research in my book shows is that when I analyze how people move, where they move, we follow people wherever they moved in the United States and actually back to Mexico and anywhere in the world. And we looked at the characteristics of the communities that they moved to, and we looked at the characteristics of the communities that they moved out of. And it turns out that once you control for a lot of things, including your income and your educational status, that the change in the population, particularly the change in the black population, change in the immigrant population, influences moving out, as does the perception of disorder. These are all clues that, to my mind, tell us why we see these persistent patterns. Now, doesn't mean it's inevitable and communities do change for the better, but on average, absent intervention and serious policies that are able to sustain vulnerable communities, we tend to see repeated cycles of disadvantage.